Hello folks, hope you're having a good day whenever you're watching this. Seems like there's some squirrel action happening behind me, so I hope you enjoyed that. Jumping right in. We're jumping back in time again this week to Shakespeare, who, as you may know, was writing around the end of the 16th century in England, in and outside of London, which is sort of considered the beginning of the early modern period. And to quote my advisor, you can't teach a Magic Ladies class without teaching Macbeth. So, a little bit of background. Even though this is the early modern period, which sort of, in its name, implies some continuity with the modern day and a break from what came before, which in England was the Middle Ages, not the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, or the medieval period. So, and even though you may have learned about this as more of like a Renaissance text, the reason I steer away from the Renaissance and using that kind of language is you may have learned about how like revolutionary the Renaissance was, but remember that Shakespeare and all of these other Renaissance figures are writing in the same traditions that we've already been reading, retelling many of the same stories and playing with the same archetypical characters, themes, and plots that can be found in medieval and classic European texts. Macbeth is no different, right? It's dealing with questions of where power comes from, who can exercise power, how is it right and honorable to get, use, and maintain power, how does gender work in these like power dynamic relationships, the same questions that we've kind of been addressing, right? So it's not like nobody was reading, nobody was writing, and then all of a sudden in the Renaissance you have all of this great stuff. Like, there is a tradition that is being continued. So I want that to be clear. And y'all know that because we've already read a bunch of stuff that was written before the Renaissance. So, like most of Shakespeare, there are a ton of different interpretations of Macbeth, the play, and of the witches and Lady Macbeth's roles in it, which is kind of what we're going to be focusing on, right? Lots and lots and lots of scholars have made whole careers out of questions and debates that surround this play and other Shakespeare plays. So we're obviously not going to be able to get into all of that in a couple weeks, but know that it is a rich text with lots of conversations happening around it all the time. Good one for a research paper, perhaps. So, I'm really only going to talk about the first act today. Before we get into that, it's worth noting that the witches in Macbeth have, to a greater or lesser extent, pretty much influenced every portrayal of witches that's come out of British and now American literature and pop culture in the last 400 plus years. Like, it is so influential to how we think of witches like today, which is why it's important to read, right, in this class. So, talking about the first act. One of the things that I want you to notice as you maybe get through the first act and first couple acts, and as you continue reading on with the play, is looking at the relationship between the characters and the natural environment. Obviously, in a Magic Ladies class, we're going to focus on the witches, or Macbeth, but like, this is kind of an interesting, I want to invite you to focus, to like pay attention to where the environment comes up as you read the play. So in Act 1, for example, the witches are accompanied by thunder and lightning each time we see them, and much of their dialogue involves like weather and or like elemental language, lending favorable winds, hovering through fog and filthy air, spending time in ports, killing pigs, etc. When they meet Banquo and Macbeth, Banquo asks them about if you can look into the seeds of time and say which grain will grow and which will not. And when they disappear, he says, the earth has bubbles as water has, and these are of them. And Macbeth attributes them with vanishing into the air, which seemed corporeal melted as breath into wind. So there's a lot of really elemental language surrounding the witches in particular. So, aside from like sort of more obvious links between witches and the environment, because of some like metaphorical or literal sense that capital N nature is a source of witches' power, there are some more interesting connections to be drawn by like reading the witches through what I and academics would call an ecocritical lens. That's a lens that highlights natural and environmental elements in text, as well as more traditional focuses like characters and plots. So for you, that's basically like what I just talked about, right? Paying attention to the ways that nature interacts with the story, with the characters, how they play with and reference nature, that kind of things, and like seeing what you can learn from that. So, some things to consider. Remember other examples we've seen this semester of magic ladies, or in the case of the Earl King, men, as representatives of the landscape, authorizing power over it, for example, like the sovereignty of Erin and the Lothar ladies. Also, consider intersections between power, class, and landscape. So, for example, the text presents some battles and some treachery that is at least hinted at in the first act, but I will not be too specific about it in case you have not read the play before, with Macbeth and Lady Macbeth and the nobles of Scotland, right? And if these battles and this treachery was happening in like the real world, like real historical 16th century, 15th, 16th century England, and these kind of battles did happen. This kind of stuff did happen, not probably as dramatic as Shakespeare puts it, or as poetic, certainly, but, you know, there were battles, there were wars, there were transfers of power. So, this stuff would have a huge impact on the landscape, and on the people who live on it, right? So, for example, historical warfare at this time, late medieval, early modern warfare, often involved decimating large portions of your opponent's land to make it less valuable to him, like taxes and what it can produce. And while it was often like wealthy nobility who were leading and orchestrating warfare, poor farmers, workers, peasants were often the most impacted by the destruction that the wealthy caused to the landscape and to the political structures. So, you know, consider, do our witches seem like they're nobility, or do they seem more like common people? What can we learn, if anything, about class relations in a play that's ostensibly about the power of kings? So, you know, just think about that stuff. We'll talk more about Macbeth next week as we get more into it. I just wanted to give you a little bit of background. Shakespeare is not like some big spark in the night where like everything began and ended with when Shakespeare wrote his plays. Like, he was working with a tradition, and there is a tradition that follows him, just like everything else. So, remember, please, that we have conferences this week. If you have not signed up yet, you should do that. You'll be late doing it, but there might still be time slots, or you can email me. But remember, these are conferences for Paper 1, and Paper 1 is due at 11:59 on Monday, October 5th. So get that in, shoot me an email if you have any questions or concerns or anything like that. I've already got plans to conference for several hours, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, so talk to most of you soon, and I'm looking forward to it. And I'm looking forward to reading your papers. I'm really excited to like get into this discussion. Alright, take care, y'all. Bye.